So I think kind of the best place to start for the first wave of feminism is in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. So what we have occurring sort of pre-Civil War is that we have a lot of feminists working sort of hand in hand with abolitionists. So you have this sort of big name feminists that we're going to see in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to 1920, kind of grouping together the abolition of slavery along with gaining sort of rights for women in general. And so we have sort of these some of the earliest groups, like the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. This sign is a little weird because it says that Lucretia Mott actually started this, which seems not to be the information that I know, but nonetheless. We have it sort of formed by a total of about 18 women. And the ones that I have pictured here all come from the same family, which are Harriet Forten, her mother Charlotte, and I believe her sister Sarah here. And all of them were freed from slavery and working to sort of get the abolition movement going to sort of allow more slaves to be freed. And of course, this sort of is pre Civil War. So we have other women joining as well that are more famous, white women. This is a really terrifying picture, which is apparently the picture I found of her, which is Angelina Grimke, who went against sort of different laws to teach Black women how to read and to get an education. And then Lucretia Mott, who's a very famous suffragette who we will talk about later. But they also become part of this society as well. So these figures are really sort of co-working on the anti-slavery movement as well as the suffrage movement. And we have a lot of these women sort of coming together to sort of create this very combined movement. You have Maria W. Stewart, who's a very famous Black woman, who is not supported sort of as a whole. I feel like all of these women sort of have in common is that when they go out, Black women, white women, any of them, when they go out and start speaking for suffrage and for the sort of anti-slavery movements, you have sort of a lot of people, even their peers, sort of coming and saying you shouldn't do this or that, because there's a lot of a resistance to this massive change that's going on in the mid-1800s. So Maria W. Stewart, she makes this speech, and she says, "What if I am a woman?" She asked, "if not the God of ancient times, the God of modern days." She was chastised by reformers, and she said, "Let us no longer talk of prejudice till prejudice becomes distinct at home. Let us no longer talk of opposition till we cease to oppose our own." So no matter what, Stewart was fought by both sides of the suffrage movement as well as the abolitionist movement, and that believed, she says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" and talked about how race and gender were intertwined and that the freeing of the slaves as a whole would be also part of freeing women as a whole as well from sort of their oppression in society. You have Sojourner Truth also being a big part of this. She's a very famous abolitionist as well as suffragette in many ways. She testified from her own experience that race and gender were inseparable, that to abolish sort of the oppression of women needed to come with the abolition of slavery as well. If we were going to give equal rights, we should give equal rights to everyone, right? Which makes sense. She comes to be really famous for this speech that she gives right before the Civil War. And it's at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851. And It's this great speech, and I have the whole text in this PowerPoint so you can read it. But a quote from it is, "I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that?" And so she was going and working hard to sort of talk about how being a Black woman, sex and race could not be sort of separated, that freedom for all meant freedom for all. And she also reminded feminists that middle-class white women's experiences do not encompass the full range of women's subordination. So this is the original text is how we think it was. So she gives this extemporaneous speech, meaning it's sort of off the cuff. She doesn't write it down. And it's this phenomenal speech. It is revolutionary at this time. And what ends up happening is no one kind of writes it down the day that she gives it. It is published in the Anti-Slavery Bugle in 1851 by Marius Robinson, and this is his sort of take on it. However, in 1863, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who's here on the bottom here in the drawing, she sort of reconstructs the speech and states, "Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman?" And so it becomes called, because of Gage, we have this speech being titled the "Ain't I a Woman" speech, even though historians have sort of believed that she never actually said those things that Matilda Jocelyn Gage stated in 1863. It's also that she writes it down 12 years after the speech is given, and so versus Robinson's, who writes it down in 1851 versus 1863. It's believed that Robinson's version of the speech is much more correct to the original, I would say. But it still becomes known as the "Ain't I a Woman" speech. So if you've ever heard of it before, and often sort of quoted in famous quotes like this one here on the bottom. But Sojourner Truth is still a big advocate for abolition, as well as suffrage movements in the 1850s, sort of pre and post Civil War. Other abolitionist works include An Appeal to Women by Sarah Fortin, who I showed you before as the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Association. You can read that as well, along with Sojourner Truth's speech when you have time. We also have other works like by Angela Grimke, who's working on anti-slavery. Again, the sort of scary image that I have. However, what we find is that an opposition to slavery did not necessarily translate into belief in racial equality. There were some anti-slavery societies who only admitted white women, which is very sort of contradictory, and Northern free Black women working on three fronts: to free the slaves, to end the race barrier within female anti-slavery movement, and to gain rights as women. However, there seemed to be sort of some inherent backlash on sort of both sides. And what we see very much at the beginning is that abolitionists and suffragettes are working together. So a lot of white women opposed the system because the dispersal of slave families and the rape of female slaves offended their ideals of womanhood. But what kind of ends up happening is something I'm going to detail out here, because I feel like it kind of explains this divide between abolitionists and suffragettes, which I think is kind of important. And we're going to spend some more time with Black women suffragettes next week. And that's sort of how I divided the PowerPoint, just because I think we really need to talk about both sides of the suffrage movement, especially as sort of abolitionists and Black women are really at the core of the start of the suffragette movement and feminist movement as a whole in the 1830s. So what we have that these two movements are working together. So I have Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left and Frederick Douglass on the right. And these groups are very much sort of working together to get not only freedom of the slaves, but also equal rights in voting. And you have sort of this monumental moment where Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton meet each other at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, where they are not allowed to speak, and are sort of furious about this. And so because of this, Mott and Cady Stanton come together to have the Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848. As I stated before, Seneca is a place that Freedman mentioned, but this whole convention happened in New York City, and it was organized by Mott and Cady Stanton, and 200 women and men invited. The second day, such as Frederick Douglass, even though the first day only women were allowed to attend. It happened here at the Tweedle Hall building, which has now been demolished. So this is kind of on the corner of where this building used to be. And at this time, women were legally prevented from owning property, executing wills or signing legal documents, serving on juries, voting in elections or meetings, refusing to have sex with their husbands, attending university, having legal custody of their children, or divorcing their husbands. And we'll see a lot of suffragettes go to college and get degrees later in the 1800s. I believe I listed this at the beginning of class in sort of that first lecture. So Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments, which is sort of a declaration of independence, and very much based on that, but in sort of a female point of view. And it lists a total of 16 facts in general, and I have attached that document on the Moodle so that you can read it. But they include the lack of women's suffrage, lack of representation and participation in government, women's lack of property rights, inequality in divorce law, inequality in education and employment opportunities, etc. And just like the original Declaration of Independence, you have women signing it at the bottom. So this very much is meant to look like the Declaration of Independence, but specifically for the feminist movement to gain women's rights in the law. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is very famous and has some great quotes here. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward women, having in directed object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And the Declaration of Sentiments to show how patriarchy itself has changed over time in response to changing economic systems, family structures, and religious beliefs, while still not giving rights to females. And these are some of the original members who we're going to talk about as sort of part of the early suffragette movement. You have Susan B. Anthony here in the front, as well as Cady Stanton. I don't see Lucretia Mott in here, though. So, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony developed the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, in 1869 as sort of the first movement. Or maybe sort of the first real sort of suffragette group. And you have this group not only supporting gaining suffrage for women, but also in abolishing slavery as well. I don't know if you guys really remember this being in the news, but I wanted to bring it up as part of class because Susan B. Anthony is such a massive feminist figure in the first wave of feminism. Trump pardoned her this year in August of 2020. She voted in New York in 1872 when women's suffrage had not yet been granted. And so she has a trial and she refuses to pay the fine. And sort of no large charges were followed by her and sort of, kept. I don't think she even serves any jail time, if I remember correctly. But the museum, the Susan B. Anthony Museum, made this kind of funny article that's, I think it's posted on NPR, which is that it rejected President Trump's pardon, stating, I'm going to read the article here to you. On Tuesday, President Trump officially pardoned leading suffragette Susan B. Anthony, who died in 1906. He noted she was arrested in 1872 for voting before it was legal for women to do so. While it was partly that Anthony would not have wanted to be pardoned, according to some historians who've pointed out that the activist did not think she'd done anything wrong, joining these voices is the executive director of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum House in Rochester, New York. Objection, Mr. President. Susan B. Anthony must decline your offer of a pardon, Deborah L. Hughes wrote in a statement. She continued, Anthony wrote in her diary in 1873 that her trial for voting was the greatest outrage history ever witnessed. She was not allowed to speak as a witness in her own defense because she was a woman. At the conclusion of arguments, Judge Hunt dismissed the jury and pronounced her guilty. She was outraged to be denied a trial by jury. She proclaimed, I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty. To pay would have been to validate the proceedings. To pardon Susan B. Anthony does the same. Hughes pointed to Anthony's support of sex education, fair labor practices, excellent public education, equal pay for equal work, and elimination of all forms of discrimination. She suggested that the best way to honor Anthony would be taking a clear stance against voter suppression and advocating for human rights for all. So this sort of ironic turn of events where you have Trump pardoning Susan B. Anthony, and then having the backlash of the Susan B. Anthony Museum say, well, it shouldn't have been illegal for women to vote, and Anthony believed that, and thus didn't really support her conviction regardless. So in this group, the NWSA, you have them working specifically to gain women's enfranchisement through federal constitutional amendment. So they were specifically trying to get the Constitution changed to allow the voting of women in elections. Now, there was a separate group called the American Women's Suffrage Association, or AWSA, that was created by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. Lucy Stone featured here on the left. And it became sort of this quote-unquote rival to the NWSA in focusing on state governments to enact laws to give women the right to vote. So it was sort of more interested in getting these sort of smaller laws put into place in each state versus sort of a larger amendment. So the kind of differences here are, I kind of gave some bullet points here. So state versus governmental moves, which I just talked about. AWSA also featured men and women, while NWSA only had female members. AWSA supported marriage and other traditional institutions, where NWSA did not. And so the AWSA mostly focused on suffrage, while the NWSA focused on issues surrounding religion and marriage, which they believed were sort of generally unjust to women. So what ends up happening in the separation between the abolitionists and the suffragettes occurs sort of around the time of 1870. So you had the left sort of individuals, so Lucy Stone is one of them, as well as Frederick Douglass, Antoinette Brown, all believing that enfranchisement of Black men was sort of the first step to equality. So once the Civil War had allowed for the abolition of slavery in 1865, you have one side of sort of the fight for suffragettes being in support of Black men getting the right to vote, that it would be the first step to equality for Black and white women. However, on the other side, you have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who believe that incrementalism, I don't know why I can't say that today, was bankrupt, and that the new amendment should include all Black men as well as Black and white women. So they had this problem with sort of slowly moving up to the vote. They believe that it should just be generally supported. So what ends up happening sort of drastically is the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which only allowed Black men to vote. And so the breach kind of between Black women's rights and white women's rights were between the 15th Amendment. And so you have Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton, along with other female suffragettes, kind of feeling separated from the abolitionist groups because of the fact that black men were able to get the right to vote before white women. And so they're sort of separate for some time. Here's the 15th Amendment for you. So in 1890, we have the National American Women Suffrage Association, where we have the coming together of the NWSA and the AWSA into one group. And it's interesting as we sort of see Anthony and Stanton kind of being allied with Southerners and sort of racially negative groups and kind of white supremacists. And we're going to talk about that more next week, but we're kind of going to stick with some of these other groups and then kind of expand more on it next week. But you have the NWSA and the AWSA, I know it's a mouthful, coming together to be the NAWSA in 1890, realizing that if they're going to get women the right to vote, they need to work together. So here is their sort of, some of their propaganda in postcards. And this is really because the Senate rejects the proposal for women's suffrage in 1887. And these women are sort of realizing that they don't want to work separately, that it's not sort of getting their ideas across as a whole. Also, as a fun side note to all of that, they also made cat postcards that supported women's right to vote, which I did not know. So it's kind of hilarious. I don't know if they're making some sort of pun on Elizabeth Cady Stanton because it's Cady versus Cady, but they are hilarious. I love this cat in this sort of old late 1800s hat. It's hilarious.